Hello and welcome to Lost Love Chronicles.
Dear listeners, today we're thrilled to give a special shout out to the incredibly talented Ronald Burns. He has generously shared an amazing story with us, and we can't wait for you to experience the magic of his words. If you enjoyed Ronald's story, be sure to explore more of his literature on Amazon. We've added links to his work in the description box below, so you can easily dive into his captivating storytelling. Now let's get on with the story. Vanessa and I have been married for 25 years. Our twin boys are in their first year at an expensive private college. Up to that point, I thought I had a profitable business and a loving family for whom I was happy to work myself to the bone. They never verbally expressed any appreciation, but I believe they were grateful. Of course, for a long time I also believed in Santa Claus, the Easter Bunny, and the Tooth Fairy. I'd been running my own ad agency for about 5 or 6 years when I met my future wife, Vanessa, who was working as a cocktail waitress at a rundown bar. She was a good-looking girl, just barely 21 with long chestnut-colored hair and a great body. It was probably not the best place to meet a moral, monogamous quality woman. But that was the last thing I was seeking that night. She leaned forward, pushing her braless breasts together with her arms so I could look down her blouse and hopefully give her a bigger tip, while she stared at my $75 fake Rolex watch, mistaking it for a $10,000 real one. I never told her the truth about the value of the watch. She was so pretty, and I wanted to impress her. Her clothes and shoes announced that she came from a poor family, and she commented that I was the wealthiest boy she'd ever dated. We only dated for 6 months before we got married. I know it was too soon, but I had been so lonely for so long, after my longtime girlfriend dumped me 3 years earlier to go find herself and ran off with her guru and my money. It's time for a confession. Vanessa was only the second girl with whom I'd been intimate. She rocked my world romantically. She did things to me in bed that I had never even imagined, and I have a great imagination. I never asked her how many lovers preceded me. I didn't want to know. I understood that she didn't learn those bedroom tricks from a book. Tricks being the operative unspoken question I never asked about. Continued access to her bedroom skills was why I was in such a hurry to marry her. I always made really good money. We had enough for our children's college tuition. We owned a nice house, had nice cars, and took frequent vacations. She may not have been the smartest woman in town, but as I've already said, I think she was the best lover in town. She was also the most loved, indulged, worshipped, and spoiled wife in town. My wife loved the luxuries I bestowed upon her and living the good life. That all changed about 6 months ago, when my largest client went bankrupt, owing me a fortune and leaving me on the hook also owing a fortune. I didn't sit back and cry. I went out and pounded the pavement for new business 2 days a week. I also had to let go all 3 of my staff who I could no longer afford to pay, and took on the added burden of their work myself. They were furious with me despite knowing the company's financial condition. They just didn't get it. While I used to work about 5 days and 45 hours a week, now I was working 10 hours a day 7 days a week. At first my wife was supportive, but after a month she became angry with me all the time. She complained that I worked so much that I had deserted the family and only cared about the business. I explained that I also cared about paying the mortgage, paying for food, etc. She couldn't seem to make the connection. I realized that she was living in a dream world when she asked if she could buy a new Mercedes, since hers was now 4 years old. Her friend Ann's car was so much newer with the latest gadgets, and she deserved one too. At first, I didn't say a word to her. I just stared at her incredulously. If you want a new car that badly, you can always go out and get a job to pay for it. Or maybe get a job and pay some of the household bills to take some of the load off of your loving husband. She called me mean, stingy, and cruel. She also complained that she couldn't get a decent job because her only work experience was as a cocktail waitress in a seedy bar. None of my friends have to work. Why should I? If you were a better husband and businessman, we wouldn't be in this situation. After that, there was no more physical intimacy between us. She scowled and never again smiled at me. Our children were furious when I explained that I could no longer afford over $100,000 a year in college tuition and suggested that they transfer to state college and take out student loans to pay for even that. When I made the obvious suggestion that they get jobs, they called me a loser and a failure who they now hated. Their reaction when I sold their Mustang convertible to pay bills made the Civil War look like a love fest. That's when I realized that I was only an ATM to these people. It wasn't as if I was in second place in their hearts. I wasn't even in the race. I never felt so alone, abandoned, and unloved in my life. I couldn't even drink my troubles away. I had to remain sober and keep working, but for what and for whom? I was exhausted all the time. I had lost weight. Frankly, I was a wreck with a lot of new gray in my hair and lines on my face. My wife was no longer at home when I returned from work. She'd saunter in around 11 p.m. and never tell me where she went. I hugged her, more to determine if she smelled of another man than out of affection. Mostly she smelled of cigarette smoke. If I had any spare money, I would have hired a private detective or rented a car to use to follow her. I couldn't do either. I was broke. After a week of this torture, she finally admitted that she was working as a cocktail waitress at an upscale restaurant during dinner. I was so happy and excited for almost a minute. I explained that we were so far behind on the mortgage that her contribution to the household budget would be a lifesaver. She laughed in my face. My money was our money, but her money was just for her. She had been unable to buy new clothes for months and on Saturday went to the mall and spent her first paycheck on one new evening dress and matching shoes. She took a sadistic pleasure in modeling the new clothes for me. I angrily pulled up her dress and found she was wearing a black garter belt and a corset. "Are you turning professional?" I asked, but she ignored me. She was going out with her girlfriend and tonight after work and wouldn't come home until very late. Then I saw an expensive new watch on her wrist. I heard a car horn honking. When I asked where the watch came from, she didn't answer, but instead ran out to her coworker's waiting car and drove off. I'm not a passive person. I don't like surprises. I like to be prepared for the worst. I dressed in a business suit and parked my car in front of her restaurant just before closing time. Her best friend in West, who I call the Wicked Witch of the West, pulled up in front of the restaurant. My wife ran out of the restaurant door in the pouring rain in her new outfit, and they drove away, and have been a pain in my ass for years. She was twice divorced and set a bad example for my wife. She had 3 children by 3 different men. One of Ann's former husbands claimed that she supplemented her income as an interior designer by being a call girl and on several occasions had pimped out friends of hers for money. I never knew if he was telling the truth. They drove to the Tally Ho, a notorious cheaters bar attached to a motel, and went inside. I spied through the rain-covered window as and introduced my wife to several men who each bought her a drink. I took photos of everything I saw. Then a new man who parked an expensive Porsche in front walked inside, kissed, and who seemed to palm some bills he unobtrusively handed to her, and discreetly handed some of the bills to my wife and introduced Mr. Porsche to her. My wife started slow dancing with him as he squeezed her bum. He wasn't that good looking, wasn't that tall or muscular, but he wore expensive clothes and of course owned an expensive sports car. His main allure to my wife, of course, was his money that she put in her bra. They sat down and had a few drinks while he rested his hand on her inner thigh under her garter belt and stroked her. I suppressed the urge to go in and knock him out, but I needed more proof of their relationship. I sat in my car fuming. I watched them leave the bar and walk 100 feet to a motel room that opened onto the parking lot. As he put a key in the door, I snuck up behind them. Because of the pounding rain, he didn't see or hear me coming. I pulled out my trouser belt, and I wrapped it tightly around his neck. "Take one more step with my wife, and I'll end you. Not if you understand." He nodded as he wet his pants. "How much did you pay and for her?" He was silent, so I tightened the belt around his neck, and he hissed out $500. I released the belt, and he ran away in a hurry. He burnt rubber with his Porsche and backed into the passenger side door of Ann's parked car, crushing it. He didn't stop, but just kept driving away, which all in all was a smart move. "It's not what it looks like," my wife said, which was no surprise. "Then what is it?" She didn't answer. I removed my right hand from hers and grabbed the money out of her bra. I counted out $250. It was then that I realized that my wife's fidelity all those years was only because of my high income. When the money pipeline closed down, her legs opened up. I finally admitted to myself what I had suspected all along, that this was what she did for a living on the side when we first met. My heart was broken. Deep down, I still tried to believe that she loved me, but I couldn't fool myself. I had never been anything more than a meal ticket. I didn't say a word to my crying wife. Instead, I walked into the bar and over to Ann. "If you ever come near or speak to my wife again, I'll scar up your pretty little face." Then I walked back out to my car and ran out of the bar and into her car. My wife tried to enter Ann's car but couldn't open the bashed-in door as Ann drove off without her. I wanted to leave my wife stranded, but our budget couldn't afford a cab ride home for her, so I let her in the car on the condition that she not say a word to me. "Tomorrow I'll file for divorce, and then you can screw as many guys for as much money as you can get out of them." Of course, she begged for forgiveness, and I ignored her cries and pleading. Then her tone changed. She called me a loser and would be glad to be rid of me so she could find a real man who could afford to take care of her. She also bragged about cleaning me out in the divorce for every cent I owned. She couldn't understand that the gravy train ran out of steam months ago, and I was broke. As I told you, she wasn't very smart. On Monday, I took steps to close down the business. I was done killing myself for my selfish, unappreciative family. I drained the last dime from the business account to pay the filing fees for a divorce into the bankruptcy court. I couldn't afford a lawyer, and besides, there were no assets to split. I had a lot of friends in the industry and knew I could easily get another job, though I wouldn't earn as much as I previously had. I made the strategic decision to wait until after the divorce was final before I sought a job, or I'd just pay out all my salary and alimony. Then I phoned the police vice squad. I told them about Ann West's prostitution ring at the Tally Ho Motel and Bar. I also supplied some photos. A few weeks later, Ann's arrest with 3 other women was on the evening news. My wife wasn't there. I couldn't warn her about the upcoming raid. Instead, I warned her that if I caught her again at the tally ho, I would beat the crap out of her and show our children the photos I took of her going into the motel room with Mr. Portia. There were no photos, but she didn't know that. Hell, I may hate her, but well, I don't know. I didn't want to see the mother of my two ungrateful spawn in jail. I guess deep down I didn't need the humiliation that her arrest would cause me either. Wearing a torn Temple University sweatshirt and jeans, I sat alone across from my wife's expensively dressed lawyer as he demanded from me the house, $5,000 a month in alimony, half of the business, and his legal fees. I laughed at him as he pushed my last 3 years' income tax form towards me and said I could easily afford it since my wife had no visible means of support. My wife took out my 25-year-old fake Rolex watch and tossed it at the table in front of me. It isn't even real. It's just as worthless as you are. I pushed several pieces of paper in front of her lawyer and laughed. They were stubs from my unemployment checks for $500 a week with another 4 weeks left until the benefits expired. A letter from the Franchise Tax Board acknowledging that I closed the business, and a copy of my bankruptcy filing. I had less than $15 in my checking account, which I proved to him. And a letter from the bank stating that since I was 6 months behind on the mortgage, they accepted the deed to the house in lieu of foreclosure. I pointed to my soon-to-be ex-wife. She earns $250 a night as a 304 at the Tally Ho Motel as I showed him photos. I want 30% of that. You didn't disclose that. Her lawyer yelled at her. I pulled about $2 in coins from my pocket. I divided them in half and pushed one of the piles to the lawyer. Will this cover your fees? I asked. He turned to his client. You told me he was rich. I don't work for free. You'll get my bill by the end of the week. You can afford it. He rose from his chair and stormed out of the mahogany and leather-filled conference room, but not before he leaned over the table and grabbed the 4 quarters. I picked up my fake Rolex from where she tossed it and put it back on my wrist. It still worked perfectly and told me it was time to leave. My wife cried and yelled, "What will I do now? I guess you can continue your career as a $250 a night aging, over-the-hill combination cocktail waitress in 304 for another year or two." But I channeled my best Clark Gable from Gone with the Wind. Frankly, my dear, I don't give a damn. Dear listeners, please share your thoughts in the comments section and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Sending loads of love to Ronald Burns for his contribution, and to all our listeners, thank you for being part of this literary journey with us. And if you want to share your work with us, please send your work at the email mentioned in the description box, and we will publish it for our listeners at Lost Love Chronicles.